So this is a continuation off of the last video on unwrapping the crate, or the PowerCell crate case, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to show basically how to get sets of info from a high poly to a low poly, and I'm showing everything. So one of the first things I'm going to have to do here is set up some color information on the high poly. And so I'm actually just going to jump right in for the sake of time on this video and start placing things. And I know these are duplicates here, so I'm just going to move those out to the side so they don't get in the way. I'm actually going to turn my base low poly here back to my special blue color that I like to use. And I do have an edit poly modifier set up for my low poly, and I'm going to keep that kind of as is. I think it's set up pretty well for baking purposes, and I need to make sure that my high poly reflects that as well. So instead of just what I could do is just move all these pieces into place, but what I'm kind of thinking is I'm going to set up a little animation, a little one frame animation, so that I can sort of pop these in and out. You'll see what I mean. But I'm going to turn on auto key here, and I'm going to move over to frame 1, and I'm actually going to move each high poly piece into location. And I pull up the transform type in. You can alt click or right click on your move tool to bring this up. I just like to hold alt and drag on the spinners so I can sort of really just slide these into the place I want. Now I have to be careful in that it actually matches my low poly when I'm moving this. You know, it sits in a similar location as far as how I built it. Oh, that's funny. I think I'm just now noticing that. Oh man, when I did the low poly for this crate, it doesn't look like I matched it to the high poly. So I'm just going to pretend that I didn't see that. And what a bummer. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna pretend I didn't see that. This is just for learning purposes anyways. I'll show you what that looks like later on, I guess. Okay, so anyways, I'm gonna line the high poly up to the low poly, sort of piece by piece. And I'm doing this all with auto key turned on, and I'm doing it on frame 1 so that it's creating keyframes that I can flip back and forth between. When I'm moving pieces for baking in Max, I like to just move objects on one axis. I try to keep it moving on one axis so that it's easy to place. I'm only having to pull just on the X or just on the Y to line pieces up, just for ease of working, really. And so if I just pull this piece over on the X, you see that it lines up. So for this one, I'm going to turn the symmetry off and slide that over. Symmetry off because I'm only going to make one, and then slide this one over. Pretty sure I'm moving these the same distance, so I'm just going to copy that value, paste, paste. And then this is a duplicate, so I'm actually just going to get it out of the way, keep it over here with the other duplicates. And that's sort of what they call exploding a mesh when you're prepping for normal map baking, or really any rendered to texture kind of baking. Projection mapping is also what it's called. So I think all of that's set up. So if I bounce back to frame 0, basically all my high poly sits back in place. And then on my low poly, if I turn off edit poly, it sort of reconstructs the mesh. So little helpful tips here to keep your scene kind of organized and easy to use. So with that set up, one of the things I do want to do is create a base for my colors. And I'm not going to be using actual albedo swatches in this case. I'm just going to choose some sort of distinct colors that I'll be able to pull out later, but this is going to be kind of like a metal, or not really a metal, but like a gold paint. I'm thinking a white paint of some sort. I think I want some kind of rubber color. And then I'm going to go through my high poly pieces and begin to place some of these colors so that I can kind of have a starting point for my texture. Gonna make that rubber. Probably a bit too purple. I mean, these would be fine-tuned later, but I like to kind of try and mimic the colors that are going to be used in the final texture. And this is really the best method, because sometimes you might have more colors and it can be hard to select out groups of information if they're all similar colors. I just know that I'm going to be using very few in this case, and so it'll be easy to select out. So I kind of have some distinct colors, easy for selecting out masks in Photoshop. So what I mean is, if you end up having like 2 different yellows, it might be kind of difficult to select out just the yellow groups. I'm going to detach some groups here. Hopefully, if I detach that, nope, that's kind of a bummer. So what I'll do is I'll undo that. I'll have to reanimate those pieces as I detached it. Probably should have done that first, but not a big deal. So I went back to frame 0. I'm just going to go ahead and detach those pieces. Apply my yellow to it. this piece as well. Apply my yellow, white. The latches look right. So that's pretty much the outside. For the inside here, let's go back to frame 1. I'm going to isolate this. And there's a little rubber kind of grommet in here that I'm going to detach. And apply that. Probably this little inside piece as well. Luckily, my buddy who built this, he actually separated these pieces out as separate elements. Kind of makes it easier for me to go in here and sort of apply some high poly materials. This is going to be a metal. I'm just going to give it kind of like a, maybe like a blue-gray. Whoops. Just like that. Oh, it's all one piece. Okay, so maybe I want this inside instead of a rubber. Maybe I want it that metal. So this just becomes a way to sort of quickly and in 3D sort of design my raw materials. So I'm going to turn on my auto key, go to frame 1 here, and just sort of quick align these pieces into place, and that set my keys for me. Attach. There we go, something like that. Let's set this. Detach that lid. Apply some yellow to it. This is going to be, I'm thinking, probably just make it white for now. And then make all these other pieces that metal. See, not all pieces are detachable by element. I mean, I could if I wanted. Maybe maybe I will. I'll just take these faces here. Should have had lower back facing off. So grab all of these here. Detach. Metal. Yeah, there we go. Something like that. Frame 1. Turn on my auto key again. And I'm just, oh, that was frame 100. Frame 1. I'm just going to quick align these out here so that these move as well. It looks like I'm pretty much set up. For a diffuse color. Sorry, trailed off there. Pretty much set up for the diffuse color, and everything's exploding like it should. And so in my opinion, this would be a good time to save. You never know when Max might decide to kind of crash out. Save as, let's do 10 here. Okay, looks good. So for projection mapping, I have another video that covers this kind of real quick, but I'm going to hit 0 on my keyboard, and we're just going to kind of blast through some of these settings. So this is not something I want to add to the high poly list for baking, so I'm just going to hide that. Oh, same for these guys. But we need our low poly selected. And I'm going to delete, that was pre-existing. Let's see. We're going to set the height, or I'm sorry, the padding to a 64. I'm going to pick my high poly. So I'm going to go ahead and pick all the high poly pieces here. And usually when I do, usually when you pick lots of pieces like this in Max, it kind of likes to update this modifier panel every time it adds each one of these pieces. So if you have a lot of pieces, sometimes selecting all of them and hitting add is not the best way to approach it. It's better to actually just select one object and hit add, and this will actually put the projection modifier on the stack like it should. And then we can just go down to that pick button within the reference geometry. You see that was the first object that it added. And we're going to do a pick list, and we're going to pick the rest of our high poly here. And this just real quick way to kind of add tons of pieces to a projection modifier within Max. And whenever you do end up doing a pick method and it adds that projection, it tries to do like an auto cage. It's always real terrible at it, so I'm just going to go ahead and reset while I'm here. Just reset that cage to snap it back to all the verts of the low poly. And I'm just going to check my settings. We want to make sure it's on use existing channel, channel 1. And then we're going to add a few elements here actually. I'm going to add a diffuse map. I'm going to add a normal map. And I'm going to add a lighting map. And this is kind of, I'm going to do an old school method here for rendering out a lighting map or an AO map inside of Max. And the advantage to this method is that you can kind of do all three of these maps together in one go out of the render to texture element. And so my diffuse map is going to pull the color, this will be the normal map, and this will be my AO. I do want to go ahead and set the output for these, so where these save, we're going to hit the ellipsis button. Go to Create Demo, Maps, and I'm going to say, these are actually old. But this first one is going to be Create Demo Diffuse. When I convert it to an albedo method, I'll save it as albedo, but I like to save it as a diffuse out of Max because I know that it means that it's not correct albedo values for PBR texturing. So it's going to be Create Demo Diffuse. Some people like to call it ID, like an ID map or a color map. I'm just going to say a D for diffuse. Hit save. 24-bit Targa, normal map. Go in here and do the same thing. except this time it's going to be underscore in for normal map, 24-bit. Lighting map's going to be called an AO map. And save that one as a 24-bit target. So those maps are pretty much set up. These are all the basic settings. I do want to make sure that we're not using any crazy... Yeah, these are all default settings under options. That's kind of what I want just to start. And the next thing that we probably need to do is kind of work this cage. So I'm going to turn on shaded mode so I can see it. And basically all I'm doing here is to make sure that when I push this cage out, that we're kind of engulfing all of the high poly elements. So I got to push this out far enough that we're getting all the high poly elements, but not so far that it skews our projections and kind of if you kind of push it to an unnecessary amount, it can kind of mess with your projection. So you want to push it just enough that it kind of captures everything and then stays nice and clean. Because when you push this out too far, you see things kind of, weird things happen. The cage kind of eats itself. So we're just going to push it out just enough to kind of capture everything. And that's my initial just kind of push them out. And with everything sort of where it's at, I'm going to do a test render for all my maps as is. And so before I commit to that test render, I want to make a copy mesh over here so I can test my maps on. And I'm actually going to collapse all the information on that one, all those modifiers. So I'm going to go ahead and hit render just as a test. These are 256 maps. And this is just saying that it's not going to auto place maps for us. And I don't really care. I'm going to say continue. And that rendered out pretty fast. And so let's go ahead and plug our maps in here. I'm going to create a test material. Under diffuse, let's just do this down here under maps. So under diffuse color, I'm going to apply bitmap, and I'm going to browse to our test map that we created. Diffuse, say yes. Let me go back up the stack, and I'm going to also turn on bump and set it to 100. It defaults to 30. Just make sure you don't miss that. I'm going to apply a normal bump, and in the normal bump slot, I'm going to apply bitmap. And I'm going to load our test normal map here. And so I'm going to go back out of the stack, and I'm just going to make sure that we turn on show in viewport, and I'm going to apply it. And so like I said, this was just a test. We did get some missed rays, it looks like. But for the most part, it looks like the test worked out pretty well, and that's the error I was talking about. I can't believe I did this whole mesh and didn't see that. Darn. But I'm not really going to problem solve that for this video. So let me think. I think that, I mean, it's looking good. I actually want to bump these up to 512s. I mean, our diffuse and our normal map are looking pretty good. But what we didn't set up here was our ambient occlusion that we want to render out at the same time. And an easy way to do this is, I mean, really all you have to do is place a standard skylight in the scene. And then we're going to go rendering, light tracer. And when we go to light tracer, it automatically turns on for us and sets sort of default settings. And so I'm just going to leave it where it's at, these default settings. And I'm going to go back to my low poly here. And we're going to re-render this test because we didn't have any we didn't have any. We didn't have that AO set up. Like if I were to load that AO into the diffuse slot, it pretty much was just a dark map. That's what it was. Gross. So that's not at all what we're looking for. So skylight. Adjust here. Put that back. And so with default settings, I must reselect that low poly and just bake again. Render. And we're going to say overwrite, overwrite, overwrite. And so a little bit larger of a map. That's actually rendering out. You can kind of see some of the AO shadows in here. This window is just a preview window. You're not going to save this picture out for anything. It has a save button. This is just a preview. It's not a texture that you would end up using. So there's my save. It looks like it updated my map, but just in case, let's go ahead and rebrowse and maybe try out that AO map now. Open. And so that's our AO in the diffuse slot. It looks pretty good. And when I check it, I kind of like to turn on my self-illumination just so that I can see shadows only. And that's actually looking pretty great. Cool. So that's looking good. We still have some issues here with our cage. And it just looks like I was being real sloppy when I made my low poly here, which is kind of unfortunate. I kind of did the low poly in a class for my students, and I guess I overlooked some of the silhouette. So I might have to compensate just a little bit. On the cage. Yeah, you see that cage isn't set up how we want it, so this isn't something you would normally want to do, but sometimes for speed's sake I might just adjust a couple of those verts to include that high poly info. We can do it on both sides. Darn. Now it was showing us that red info, and that's just kind of like a highlight function for where it finds errors or misses the high poly when it's looking for it. So I adjusted that, and if we re-rendered, it would fix some of that for us. But I'm keeping it at a low resolution for the moment, just so I can kind of check for errors, do quick renders, and I know this piece was kind of strange, but I'm not sure what it's doing there exactly. Okay. So 512s are looking pretty good. I think I'm going to kick this up to a 1024 and go in here and turn off my ray miss check, because I'm pretty much done doing tests. It looked like everything baked out pretty well. So aside from that, and I just fixed that. So I'm going to go ahead and do not really a final render, but I'm going to turn off ray miss check so I can get a more accurate and much larger render here. Observe it. I'm going to pause while this goes. So there's my render. It's much larger, so we might be able to kind of see our maps at a sort of a better resolution here, see if there are any smaller issues that we might have to deal with. I am going to turn off my diffuse because I kind of just want to look at the normal map up close. I'm going to turn on some, as soon as it figures it out, there we go. Turn off my self-illumination, and I'm going to turn up my specular so I can see how my normal map is kind of working. That was expected because I have these holes in the mesh. I would end up painting that out in the end in Photoshop. There we go. So I'm just kind of looking at the mesh here, and 1024 is a bit low for kind of high res information on this. You can see we're getting some breakdown. There was just a lot of surface area on this prop, not quite catching all the details with a 1024 map. So the final map size would end up probably being a 2048, so we can prevent some of this low quality look. But for the most part, I'm not seeing any crazy seams, or there's a little bit of some of that's actually baking from the high poly. We have some smoothing issues on the high poly, I believe. Yeah, it's there. So that's not really the fault of the low poly, and the high poly would need to be cleaned up a bit if we were going to deal with this. I might end up throwing like a quick fix for that. Might be something like smooth modifier, and just maybe put like an auto smooth on it. It's just telling me that that front face wasn't completely flat. Uh-oh. Me dragging on sliders. Fantastic. Oh no. Yeah. I said something like 25. Gross. Well, that's just the high poly, and that's kind of a bummer. Looks like we got kind of something on the front of this one too. Smoothing groups on the high poly. That's something that is just this asset specific because it was done in another modeling application, Fusion 360. It kind of came in some weird smoothing that's carrying over into that normal map bake. It kind of shows up worse on a low poly mesh because it has less pixels on the map to represent or to kind of fake it to a flat surface. Like a normal map's job is almost to read the difference between the low and the high poly and smooth that out. But in this case, there's not really enough. Got some there. Some of that will go away when we bump up the map size. So I'm going to go back here, set this to a 2048. I was thinking everything was looking pretty good. Oh wait, let's take a look at our AO. That's what I want. Check. Let's go back and turn it on. So diffuse, self-illumination. I'll turn my specular level off and just look at the shadows. We're getting some shadows here on the side, and I think it's because our PowerCell here is a little too close. So just note that when you're baking your map, you're going to want to move this probably further out to the left. This is just sort of a disadvantage to the light tracer method, is you can't really restrict how far objects find shadows, and so you just have to make sure they're far enough apart from each other. I'd be surprised if this didn't, both of these didn't sort of cast shadows on each other. It kind of looks like they did. Oh well. 2048, 2048, 2048. I'm going to go ahead and bump up some settings on my light tracer. So go back to light tracer. I'm going to set it to, if you look at the shadows though, you can sort of see that it almost looks splotchy. It has a lot to do with the sample rate right here. Might bump it up to something like 500 and then set the spacing. That's how far these sort of splotches are away from each other. I set the spacing to 8 by 8, so it's a little bit tighter. So there's more of them, a little bit tighter. You're going to get a higher quality AO bake out of this. Okay. Check, check, check. So that's good. Last thing I'm probably gonna do, and this is something you're gonna do on a final render. And I'm calling this final, even though there are little things that we could fix, just for the sake of keeping this video short. I'm gonna go ahead and set up sort of a, they call this a super sampler, a global super sampler, and this is just gonna kind of increase the quality of rendering on this final map. And you can do a Hammersley at a quality of 1. That drastically increases render times. And when I'm doing a lighting map with a skylight in the scene, I don't really like to use Hammersley. It kind of creates ridiculous render times. So I'm going to compromise and do a max 2.5 star. It's also a great sampler, super sampler. And so that looks good. Radius check is off. 2048 maps. I think we're ready for a quote-unquote final render pass here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit don't show and overwrite on all of these, and then I'll see you guys when these renders are done. I'll let you know how long it kind of took. So that wasn't too bad of a render. It only took about 7 minutes or so. And let's go ahead and close that. Close that. And this is my 2048. I mean, you can still see that there's still some splotches in that AO. So I mean, to get at a 2048 to get like a really good kind of nice clean render, I mean, I'd have to take it from like 500 samples to maybe something like 600, 700, 800 samples. I mean, who knows? I mean, that wasn't that long of a render, so you know, that's something I could potentially do. But just be aware of kind of what causes that. Let me take a look at my normal map. Turn off the diffuse. And this guy's looking pretty good. I'm just checking to see. Looks like some of those, actually the majority of those issues that we're seeing in the normal map are indeed from the high poly smoothing groups. Some things to look out for and fix. So I do want to pull a couple of more maps off of this. I have my diffuse. Let's take a look at that as well. The color. I'm going to duplicate this. material. So one's going to be my AO, and the other one's going to be my diffuse checker. So they're my base colors. Rendered out pretty nice. And also, if you guys wanted sort of a quick way to look at this in max flat, you could just throw a plane out here and apply these and look at your maps that way too. Okay, so those next couple of maps are tricks, and I'm just going to throw some dirty tricks out here at you. One of the first ones would be, actually let's save the scene before we get too far ahead. I would save as, and I'd put, I'm actually going to call this 11, but I'm going to put a marker on the end of it and say normal and AO, or just say something like projection normal, in case I ever need to come back to this file and clean up some issues. Okay, so after that, I'm going to show you how to create a quick sort of dust map, and this doesn't even have anything to do with the high poly, but just with your low poly, you can actually do rendering. Let's see, render surface map. You set this to a 2048, and then I'm just going to launch dust map and get a really nasty effect here. Huh. What did I run that on? That's interesting. Make sure scene bleed. Nope. I'll just run it without the projection modifier. I've never seen that. Collapse all this. Dust map. Ah, there we go. Something with that projection modifier. But that's a map that we can use. We're going to apply that here. Dust map. Save this to our maps folder. Call this crate demo. I don't know, dust. Targa 24-bit. And then I'm going to look at this on my map here, or on my mesh. Let's turn off the bump and just apply that dust. And it just gives us this sort of top-down gradient. The thing about it is that you get these, let me make this 100% self-illuminated so you can see. No spec. But you end up getting these low poly artifacts. You can see the triangles kind of coming off of this. And that's not really what we're looking for. I mean, this is quick and dirty, but we want something. If you want something higher quality, I'll show you that next. And that tends to, we'll actually bake this one from our high poly. And so in this case, we're going to wipe clean, and this is why I saved, just because I'm going to change our materials here. I'm going to put just sort of a solid color or one material on our whole low poly, or I'm sorry, put a single material on our whole high poly here. And in the diffuse, I'm going to apply a fall off. And I'm going to set the fall off to, I believe it's towards and away, and then world z-axis, so it's top to bottom. I'm going to flip-flop the colors here so we get white on top, black on bottom. And then I'm going to make it visible in our viewport. So we'll go to the top of the material, set to show in viewport. And then now we have this sort of better quality dust map, if you will. So anything that's pointing up toward the world where dust might collect, it's going to be white. And where it's pointing away from the world or top of the world, it's going to be dark, so no dust would be collecting. And then for this, you would just bake out the diffuse. So I'm actually going to delete normal map, lighting map, because we applied this to a diffuse. It's just a diffuse that we need to bake out. I'm going to go ahead and delete my skylight, and I'm going to go to rendering, light tracer, and I'm going to turn off light tracer because that just adds unnecessary time to our renders. Same projection, and I'm going to hit, actually we do need to change the output name too so we don't override our demo, or I'm sorry, our diffuse map. And I'm just going to call this G1 for like gradient 1. We're going to end up doing another gradient here in a moment. And I'm going to hit render. This one's pretty fast, but I'm still going to pause it. So that map finished out, and just so you can sort of see a comparison here, I'm going to duplicate this and duplicate the material, change it from dust to gradient 1, and then apply that, change the name. Now we ended up getting quite a bit of gray on this. You could end up adjusting the curve on the fall off. Let's see, curve. Yeah, you could end up adjusting the curve. We kind of have a flat curve here. Probably would have been better to do like a, I guess it'd be the other way, like that. But you could just also level this in Photoshop to get the whites just on the top. But that gives you a much kind of higher quality dust map versus this one with all the artifacting. I use both, it just depends on what I'm doing, time limits and such. Last map I kind of want to show you guys is to render out a gradient from top to bottom, and this one's pretty easy as well, but using a similar method. So I'm going to duplicate that fall off material, and instead of a fall off, I'm just going to right click, cut it out of there. I'm going to do a gradient ramp, and I'm going to set the W here to a -90 and set it to some special map channel like map channel 6. And on our high poly, of course we're going to apply it to our high poly. So let's apply it. Give it a crazy name. We applied the gradient material, but now we need to map it in a special way. And so I'm going to apply a UVW map, and I'm just going to planar map this guy from maybe the x-axis, hit fit. Make sure that we can see our gradient in the viewport, which I can't. Oh yeah, sorry, that special map channel. We got to make sure that we set the same map channel to map channel 6. So it's 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, and then it snaps into place. But it's not the right axis here, so I'm going to set it to map channel Y, or alignment, sorry, planar map Y, and I'm going to do a fit. I just want to make sure that the gizmo is a little bit wider. So scale tool. I'm just going to scale it up just so it's not touching the top of the mesh, because it tends to leave a little dark spot on it. So if I just scale it up just a little bit, we'll get rid of that. So now we have this gradient on this guy as well. That we can also bake out. So go diffuse, G1, and we'll change the name here to G2 for the output. Save, and then render that one out. And that map's done, and I'll show you what that looks like. We'll duplicate this one over. Make another map here, or another material. Gradient 2. Change the name of this one. And that's what that gradient looks like. And so really this is just ways to get different sets of information out of 3ds Max. So I mean, just about anything that you can apply to a diffuse slot, you can bake out of Max. It needs to be supported by the render to texture, and render to texture pretty much only supports scanline render maps. So if you're using maps from Mental Ray or Arnold in newer Macs, then you're not going to be able to bake those out. But any kind of old school procedural maps that you can put on a, I don't know, get to show up on a diffuse texture, maybe even a vertex painting, you know, you can get that out of Max and onto a flat map like this, and use these for texturing. I mean, where we're at, that kind of wraps up most of everything that you need to know for completing this mesh. We might want to, in fact, let's go ahead and do that. Sort of reset the mesh up for export. And so I'm going to save this where it's at. Save. And then prep this guy. For export. So I added all my duplicate pieces again. So we got both our latches, all of our little boxes copied over, both handles, and then this guy would be ready for export. And you see when we apply our maps, both handles share the same texture. Oh, there we go. Both cylinders share the same texture. And this guy is sort of ready to go. Hope that helps and gives you some idea on some of the basics for projection mapping. Thanks for watching.